Okay. All right. So I think now I'm just going to introduce Bill because the Newsom is our faculty sharing talk today. So he's going to tell us about some of his journey and his thoughts. So let's see if you think we have slides. Great. So you want to shut it down?
Okay. Thanks, Willman. It's a pleasure for me to have the platform here for the next 15 minutes. And I'll try to stop at the end of 15 minutes, whether I'm finished or not, because it's important for us to hear from the students and really important, I think, for us to break into these groups and generate smaller group discussions among ourselves. So it's great to see so many people that I don't know or barely met or only seen your faces on 2x2 boxes on a computer screen. It's a privilege to be here and have everyone here together. I'll start sort of introducing myself. Who am I? And there are a number of facts kind of you want to know. I was raised in a religious family. My father and grandfather were both Southern Baptist ministers in North Florida. And any of you who know anything about Florida understand that it's really two states. North Florida is culturally and politically a part of the South. And South Florida is culturally and politically a part of the North because it's dominated by retirees, who've come down from northern cities to South Florida. And then Dade County around Miami is its own thing. That's part of the Caribbean, really. So Florida's a very strange place. I was born in 1952. That makes me 72 years old now. The most relevant thing here is not that I'm 72, but it's that I came of age during the 1960s, which was a very turbulent time in the history of this country. It means that I grew up with the Jim Crow system, right? I lived in a little town of 10,000 people. 70% were white, 30% were black. We had separate schools, we had separate pools, we had separate bathrooms, buses, everything. And I grew up and came of age, I think, intellectually, religiously, socially during the turmoil of that period that had a huge impact on my subsequent life. So that's why 1952 is up there. I was interested in science from an early age. I took a biology course when I was, ninth grade, I think, and had a very demanding teacher, but a very sort of, she wasn't charismatic, but she was engaging. And I got really turned on by the world of organisms that I could see inside of a single drop of water under a microscope, and sort of decided I really wanted to be a microbiologist. And interestingly, this interest in science, I had no obstacles from my family at all. There were no objections to my being a scientist on religious terms or anything. In the Southern Baptist era of that time, there was a range of kind of theological views. And I remember hearing my father teach in teachers' meeting about different ways of interpreting the first chapter of Genesis and origins of life and such. And I hunted for fossils with my father. And so there was always some interest in science around. I was never instructed or presented. You have to choose science, or you have to choose, being true to the Word of God. That did not happen for me. And unfortunately, too many kids, smart kids, engaged kids, that happens. So I think it's a tragedy when it happens. I went to a small liberal arts college in Florida. At the time, it was related to the Florida Baptist Convention. I majored in physics. I had baby physics, nothing like grad school or anything. I decided I wanted to do biology in grad school and went to Caltech. Went from this small liberal arts college in Florida to one of the citadels of world science, right? I was too young to realize what a jump that was, what a leap that was. And it's good that I didn't realize it. It worked out. Did a postdoc at NIH after finishing my PhD. So I'm bouncing back and forth between the coasts here. First faculty position was at SUNY Stony Brook. Some of you may know Stony Brook. I was there for 4 years, but I came to Stanford, jumped at the chance to come back to the West Coast, 1988, which puts me now in finishing my 36th year at Stanford. And I don't know where all that time went. It's just crazy. It'll happen to some of you also, who are relatively new here. So I'm Christian by conviction as well as by culture. Growing up in the Southern Baptist community and the family that I grew up in, I certainly wasn't going to be a Muslim or a Buddhist. Probably not going to be an atheist, though you never know about these preachers' kids, right? They can go the opposite way. It can be a repellent. But as a consequence, I've had a lifelong interest in science and religion issues. And I think that's one thing that drew me into neurobiology, because early on, I kind of had the conviction that my experience in a church pew and service was real and meaningful, and my experience in a laboratory was real and meaningful. And the one thing that was in common to both of those things was this brain up here. You're using your brain in both of these realms of endeavor, and many others as well. And it just seemed to me like the brain was a really interesting thing to study. I didn't know anything about neurobiology when I started graduate school in neuroscience at Caltech. And I went to, I don't want to diverge. I'll never get finished here if I diverge too much. So I've had a lifelong interest in these issues. If you get into them at all, you realize it's a whole area of learning and a whole discipline that people spend years and careers on. And I have sort of view myself as a little bit of a dilettante, but I'm a little more serious than a dilettante. And I give talks on science and religion issues at different universities and seminaries and student groups around the country. I try to do a couple of them a year. I view it as a tithe of my speaking time, so to speak. Any faculty member here or staff member, senior staff member could stand up and give a story similar to mine. It would be different. And we wind up in different places. I migrated from my Baptist background to membership in an Episcopal church here in Palo Alto now, and feel pretty much at home there, though I still have some problems with the ascendance of the Book of Common Prayer over the Bible. It seems like sometimes you can find the Book of Common Prayer a lot more easier in my church than you can find the Bible, which is very different from my Baptist upbringing. But I think C.S. Lewis, maybe in Mere Christianity, used the metaphor of a house to describe the different denominations in Christianity, the differences that we have, which can be substantial at times. And C.S. Lewis said, we're all under the same roof, we're all part of the same house, but you walk into any house and the rooms are decorated in different ways and have different functions. And he said, but the main thing to remember is we're part of the same community and live in the same house. And that's an image that I've always, taken comfort in over the decades, though that image has become strained, honestly, just speaking very frankly, for me in the past decade as Christian religion, both left and right, becomes more deeply intertwined with secular politics. And that presents some real challenges that I think maybe haven't been seen from the church since the Civil War, when the church is split over the issue of slavery. And that's something that, I don't know, we're going to have to work out. So being a scientist, of course, I get asked a lot, in various guises, like religion and science in conflict with each other. And I have a whole talk on this, and I'm just going to give you the big takeaway highlights, that there are no conflict to me between my religion and the findings, the discoveries of science. So I think that, for example, the Big Bang is maybe the scientific notion and that is most consonant with the notion of creation in Genesis, right? Because from the Big Bang, we know that our universe has not existed infinitely into the past. There was a moment when it wasn't here, and then there was a moment when it was here. And a lot has happened in that 14 billion years, but there was a time of creation. Similarly, I don't feel like the theory of evolution needs to be a big obstacle. I think God can create however God wants to. Who am I to put restrictions on God? And if we think hard about evolution and some of the objections to it, I don't think it stands up. And I think that the scientific evidence for evolution is very good. But I think conflict occurs when between religion and science, when the working assumptions of everyday science become elevated to a point of an ideology. And the ideology that I'm meaning, some people call scientism, but it's the assertion that science is the only path to reliable knowledge about the world. And I'm a scientist, I love science, but I certainly don't believe that. But that notion, that assumption, that is pawned off frequently, all too frequently, as part of science itself. And it's not, it relies on extra scientific assumptions. So, the example I always give, what's an example of an important question that science is not a reliable guide for? Well, an important question is it better to live or to die? And, there are people, and you have known people, perhaps you've been there yourself, where that's a real living question. Or you have family members for whom it's a real question. And you can't go in a laboratory and do experiments and demonstrate whether it's better to live or to die, right? And there are many questions. I would say the most important questions in our life really cannot be addressed by science. So another question is whether to marry a particular person. If you wait for scientific evidence about whether you should do that, you're going to be waiting a long time. And I think in marriage and in many other kinds of endeavors that we have, like raising kids and stuff, you have to take a leap of faith, and you have to live through the experience before knowledge really comes to you. And that's a model of epistemology that's kind of at odds with the scientific model. But I think it's real life. And I think it's the situation that we're all in, whether we're atheists or theists or scientists or non-scientists. And I believe that this weird epistemology that I'm talking about here is shown in this Bible passage from 6th chapter of John. Jesus is talking in the 6th chapter of John about some very difficult material about body and blood, and the gospel reports that many followers left when he started talking about this stuff. And then Jesus said to the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" And Simon Peter answered, "Lord, to whom would we go? You have the words of eternal life." And I think that Peter was on the money here. I think, I've been in academia for, my entire life, really. And I haven't found a better way to go about living, a better coherent view of the world and my life and my values than following Jesus. And then this gets tacked on in the 69th verse here. After he says, "You have the words of eternal life," he says, "And we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." But this captures this kind of inverted epistemology that I'm talking about. In science, you would say, "Well, I want proof. I want to know the facts and know that this is true, and then I will believe." But Peter says, "We have believed and come to know." And I think that that's the way life really works in the most important things in life. Whether it's marriage or child raising or what, you have to just step out of the absence of scientific evidence and go for it. Now, this doesn't mean that we check our brains at the door. Okay, I want to really emphasize that. When you decide to marry or commit, or you decide to make decisions that affect your children's future or other people's future, you think you assemble all the evidence in your mind that you can, right? All the facts, all the knowledge, the evidence. You may consult wise people who've been mentors to you and have shown their own wisdom through the living of their lives. But in the end, it doesn't amount to proof in the sense that any of us want in a scientific sense. So, this business of believing and coming to know or coming to not know, think I've gone down the wrong path here and I've got to readjust. That's just the human condition as far as I'm concerned. So, I don't see any big conflict on those grounds. Now, things get a little sticky. One of the reasons that I told you that I came into neuroscience was that I really wanted to I thought that the brain was the seat of my experience in the church as well as in the laboratory. And I get involved in questions like this frequently. Oh, there it is. Okay. Dialogues about the brain and religious belief. And I get asked a lot by audiences, is there a God spot in the brain? Is there a part of the brain that, is responsible for belief in God? And there's not a God spot. There are circuits, but there's not some single magical spot. This dialogue, I start with what I call here the central dogma of neuroscience. Those of you who are cellular molecular biologists will realize this is a play on Francis Crick's famous dogma, central dogma of molecular genetics. And the central dogma of neuroscience, I think every neuroscientist walks into the lab every day with this assumption in their back pocket. And the dogma is that all of our behavior and all of our mental life, including our sense of a conscious continuing self, is inextricably linked to the biology of the brain. And this is not known fact. This is fundamental assumptions that guide research in neuroscience. But boy, it sure gets better and better. It's looking better and better as every decade goes by with the discoveries that get made about neural mechanisms underlying very sophisticated behaviors. And I would argue even religious behaviors. And a guy who really kind of thought this all along was this man, William James, who was the sort of the father of modern psychology, lived and worked in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and wrote this remarkable book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was very interested in religion. And this guy he explored everything. He went to lots of different churches. He went to seances. He went to paranormal experiences. He was interested in ESP. And he wrote this book that's endured and is still on required reading lists in many courses, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he believed that these things were rooted somehow in our brains. And I was a part of a team of 4 people. I just kind of fell into this. I didn't plan on this happening. We published this commentary in Nature in July. It was published on July 4th, which the editors at Nature decided to entitle "Neuroscientists Must Not Be Afraid to Study Religion." But we're arguing here that without making any assumptions about whether religion is true or false, without the lobbying for it or trying to shoot it down, it is a real human phenomena. Over 80% of the people on the planet acknowledge religious beliefs of some kind or the other, or practice, which is probably more important than beliefs in many cases. And that it seems to be a fundamental aspect of human behavior. And there are circuits, if you believe that central dogma, there are circuits in the brain that underlie this. So we've kind of took up the cudgel and argued that this should be more central to neuroscientific study of the human brain. This has become even more relevant with this increased interest that I'm sure you are all aware of over the past 5 to 10 years in psychedelic drugs to treat major depressive order and acute anxiety. So a big emphasis here, the psychedelic drugs run rampant where they were in the 1960s and 70s are dangerous and not to be done. No one here is advocating the use of psychedelics indiscriminately, because that can lead to so many bad outcomes. But in tight association with talk therapy and in proper doses, there are pretty impressive preliminary data out there that drugs like psilocybin, it's just a very simple molecule that you can see its structure up here. That's the classic magic mushroom extract. And MDMA, which is not really a psychedelic, it's ecstasy. It's the party drug, the familiarity kind of drug. But the evidence is increasing through papers like this that these drugs, when administered in the right context and in the context of therapy, can lead to, and you can just read the title of the paper, mystical type experiences occasioned by psilocybin mediate the attribution of personal meaning and spiritual significance 14 months later. What this means is that people who are dealing with some kind of psychiatric or psychological crisis, whether it's a disorder like acute anxiety or major depressive disorder, or OCD or PTSD is a big one that this is being experimented with right now, can have some remarkable recoveries. People who have been depressed for years and their depression is treatment resistant. There's really interesting preliminary data just published in the past 2 years that this with a single administration of the drug in combination with the talk therapy, people can become remarkably better. And this 14 months is important because people will tell you 14 months later, 28 months later, that this experience that they had in this therapeutic and psychedelic context was one of the most important experiences of their lives, and the treatment effect is still good. You think of a single dose treatment that is on some of the most refractory diseases and is still having positive effects a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years later. That's really important. And as a scientist, as a neuroscientist, I want to know everything there is to know about that, because this is a really interesting thing. You know, this use of psychedelics in combination with religious ritual, there's 5,000 years of use of it in North America with either with peyote, which comes from a cactus, mescaline is the actual chemical there, or the mushrooms. And so this is not new, right? It's not new. But this was an article from the New York Times just this weekend. And it's veterans and lawmakers lobby and bipartisan push. How many things get bipartisan push in Congress these days for the FDA to approve MDMA therapy? The FDA is going to rule on this sometime very soon. The expert group that the FDA assembles to advise them on new treatments like this was overwhelmingly opposed to this. They said the data are just not there to be for this to be convincing, and I can tell you why. I can tell you some of the issues. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is now reaching the political arena, and this bipartisan group, what their main concern is veterans of our armed forces committing suicide at a remarkable rate and with no real effective treatment for PTSD. And they're hoping that this is it. So this is very contemporary, all right? So some of these experiences, to my mind, have strong resemblance to a conversion experience. People will tell you 3 and 4 and 5 years out that it was, as I said, the most important experience, one of the most important experiences of their lives, second only to, the birth of their child or something like that. And that it has changed the way that they look at life and changed the way they look at things in a fundamental way, and that they can handle things they couldn't before. And so I wonder, as a neurobiologist, I wonder if, some of the circuits that are being tacked, are being touched by these drugs in the therapeutic context might be some of the circuits that mediate religious life and religious conversion. I don't know whether the answer to that is true. I mean, historically, religious experience is hard to study neurobiologically because you can't put somebody into a scanner and scan their brains and say, okay, have a religious experience now. Our scanner's ready to go. Tell us when your experience is starting. But there are potential ways to do this now using virtual reality and stuff that we actually review in that little perspectives piece of Nature, if any of you are interested. So, one of my real cautions here is that not all conversions are the same. Sometimes I think of these transcendent experiences being a part of something larger than yourself, which is, I think, fundamental to a lot of religious and Christian experience. But I think it was fundamental to the Nazi movement in pre-war Germany as well. If you look at the movies of these people listening to Hitler and raising their arms and with fervor yelling, those people were having a transcendent experience. They were giving themselves and their judgment up to something larger than themselves. So I think the human brain has the capacity to do these kinds of things, but how do you distinguish between a conversion and a transcendent experience that is going to be life-affirming and nurturing versus ones that are going to be destructive? And that is not at all clear. And it's not at all clear, what a Christian response to these would be even in their best circumstances. I think we can't help but be sympathetic to the plight of people with PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, and come on with some of these things and wisely and conservatively seeing whether the therapies pan out. But do we believe that that would be a substitute for trust in the maker of everything and the maker of ourselves? And I think not. I think we wouldn't. How we distinguish between those things is important. So this is some of the baggage that I bring as a neuroscientist to my lifelong interest in science and religion. This kind of stuff is new. And I'm sure that all of you have things from your disciplines that are challenges for you, that are challenges for us as Christians, for Christians in the academy. And I think that's what we will split into groups and talk about here. So I will stop. Even I went too long, but I hope that we still have time to hear from the students and also hear from discussions, because I'm just one person here. And I think, you know, some of this stuff is really interesting and pertinent for our social, political life, our understandings of our Christian anthropology, our understandings of who we are as human beings, our understandings of how that's related to brain activity. And there are all kinds of questions. How does God speak to us? You know, when God interacts with our lives, what's that all about? Is there some magical force interacting with our neurons and causing them to fire? Or does God interact through natural systems that are in our brain and meant to integrate different kinds of information that will lead to appropriate religious responses? These are big questions. And another big question for neuroscience is about soul, the traditional concept of soul. And I think that also is something we could talk quite a bit about. I was sitting over here talking to Jonathan about black holes, and he's sitting here trying to do mathematics for what goes on inside the interior of a black hole. And I think that's pretty challenging, pretty interesting. I asked him, can you do that for the brain? He said, no, the brain is far too complicated. He's probably right about that. Wilman, I'll turn this back over to you. So,
Thanks, Bill. Quick, tough question on neurobiology. Okay, if not, we just move because the time is so we gotta go next to the studio. Yeah,
so I'm available. I've just gotten back off of sabbatical recently, and a lot of people don't know.
Right. Okay, so now we go to the students, some of the fellowships. So Evan, talking about the university fellowships, right?
All right, yes. Oh no, this is the old version, I think. Oh, you can use, yeah, I should one. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Which one? I mean, like in the drive.
Drawing. Okay. Yeah. Well, good. We have everything on the cloud, right? So,
This one?
yeah.
Oh, you can. On the other one. Okay. This one, the PDF. Oh, yeah, more. I can do.
Right, then just look at the files.
Yeah.
In front.
I can do that. Only a student.
Because it's sand of the
Sure.
otherwise. My neck is well.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Evan, and I'm currently one of the members of InterVarsity Graduate Christian Fellowship at Stanford. yeah, I mean, like I will probably start with a little bit of introduction about myself, and then and how I actually relate to InterVarsity, and then I will cover 4 points, hopefully quite briefly. I mean, like one is about who we are. I mean, like as InterVarsity, and then what we do, basically our activities at Stanford, and what do we care about, and also some points of gratitude and hope, basically for this kind of collaboration between faculty and students. What we might explore together. Yeah, I think I will introduce myself. So I'm Evan, and I'm actually from Indonesia. I didn't come from a Christian family, but I turned into Christianity when I was in Singapore, when I studied at the National University of Singapore. And InterVarsity has been a big part of my life, because in Singapore, I actually became Christian through Fellowship of Evangelical Students. That's the same body as InterVarsity USA. And I was grateful, because like there are so many things which I think like God works providentially in my life, leading me towards Christianity. And I think there are a couple of reasons why InterVarsity has been impactful for me. One is, there are a couple of reasons, but I will give you a few. One is that I think I really appreciated InterVarsity actually didn't shy away from the best of scholarship actually in Singapore. So they encourage the best of learning, and they encourage discussion and dialogue of people from different beliefs, and I always feel very welcome actually. I'm like discussing different things, and I really appreciated that kind of spirit. And I was also encouraged by the examples of life led by the alumni basically of the InterVarsity when I was in Singapore.